Hi, Mark Lira here, covering my final project for English 3D5, Literature and Leadership. So for my final project, I selected an analysis of a classic short story, A Descent into the Maelstrom, which is written in 1841 by Edgar Allan Poe. My project also includes a few drawings, some artistic renderings, that I hope will capture some of the emotions and feelings that I've had in reading the material and also for my final project, holistically speaking. Before I dive into the story itself, I'd like to quickly summarize why the project is important to me along with my approach to the project. So, why is the project important to me? Well, as I described in my initial proposal, much of the motivation for this project comes directly from my love of the English written word and its many forms of expression, whether it's art, music, film, or what have you. My influence in English and literature came from two very good teachers in elementary and high school that I had the pleasure to experience. My first experience with classic literature, at least that I recall, was in the 5th grade. I just transferred to a new school and quickly bonded with my English teacher, who was Mrs. Higgins. We spent the better part of several classes reading, interpreting, otherwise discussing Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which is one of my favorite pieces. We discussed the poem's darkness and, of course, the narrator's infinite pain, remorse, and grief. And at the time, I remember feeling that was a difficult thing to have to overcome. Was learning how to interpret and read poetry, let alone poetry that was written many years ago. And it was at first a little difficult for me. I ended up enjoying the experience, but not before struggling through a little bit first. So English became and remained the bedrock of my professional life as well. One of my strengths, as I would like to call them. Over the years, I moved away from the classics and instead honed my skills on financial business cases, requests for proposal responses, and technical white papers, and just business communication in general. So that was obviously a big shift for me, and something I felt I did pretty well. My final project will be about experiencing the classics again, especially myself, and taking from them the same things I loved about English class in my early years of life at elementary school. So that's the motivation. In terms of how I approached the project, as I also described in my proposal, my process included selecting a classic work that I haven't read before, in this case, Descent into the Maelstrom. I selected a short story. Edgar Allan Poe's poetry and short stories have always been interesting and challenging for me, and for me to read and interpret. So while I frequently tell people professionally to feel comfortable being uncomfortable, usually from a business transformation perspective, I thought the same should apply for me, and why should I be any different, and why not take my own advice? So that's kind of what I've done here. So with my piece of literature selected, I did I focused my attention on the details of the approach. Specifically, I decided to read the short story several times, once straight through, without really consciously note-taking, looking up definitions and other sorts of things like that. And then, once again, focused on the meanings, dissecting them, and then the last time that focus on visualization. And that helped me create the pictures in my mind that I'm sharing here as well. Next, in terms of framing the story, A Descent into the Maelstrom is considered by many to be Poe's form of ratiocination, which is all about exact thinking and reasoning, like somewhat similar to what we would find in detective fiction stories. This short story is set in Norway, around the coast, specifically the kind of northeast, or actually it would be northwestern coast of Norway, presumably in or around 1841, which is when this was written. The opening scene is set on a mountain summit of Helsingen, which overlooks the Lofoten Islands along Norway's coast, as I mentioned. Here you see a picture of what that looks like in terms of where the Lofoten Islands are located in Norway. Descent into the Maelstrom employs four nameless characters, consisting of an unknown narrator, an old man, and the old man's two brothers, one younger brother and one older brother. So Poe's short tale is a frame story, which we've learned is also known as a story within a story. As a preface to the story, Poe calls upon a quote from 15th century English essayist and philosopher Joseph Glanville's essays on several important subjects in philosophy and religion. And it goes like this, and I quote, "The ways of God in nature, as in providence, are not as our ways, nor are the models that we frame any way commensurate to the vastness, profundity, and unsearchableness of His works, which have a depth in them greater than the well of Democritus." Excuse me. So Glanville's quote references the well of Democritus, who was a Greek philosopher remembered for his formulation of the atomic theory. The well of Democritus seems to allude to the infinity of the universe, and in this case the infinite depth of the maelstrom, which the character submerges himself into, which we'll talk about here in a bit. Interesting, like the physical makeup of an atom, Poe's short story also includes an outer layer comprised of electrons in the analogy, and the inner layer or nucleus that's comprised of the neutrons and protons. So another layering kind of theme there. On a related note, somewhere I read that it wasn't uncommon for Poe to somewhat tinker with quotes that he's used in his works, adding, removing words to better suit his needs, and this was the case with the descent into the maelstrom as well. He did select different words that slightly tweaked and tuned the quote, but left the innards pretty much intact. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So let's first start with the discussion about the outer layer. So the outer layer is told from the perspective of the unknown narrator. The outer story sets the scene on this classic short story, and the narrator and the old man in the beginning have just completed their summit overlooking Norway's Lofoten Islands, which are in the Barents Sea in the Arctic Ocean. And I have an artistic rendering of what I think they were looking down upon that I've shared here. So hopefully that's coming across okay. The Lofoten Islands have been the epicenter of great cod fisheries for over 1,000 years, especially in winter where the cod migrates to spawn. So fishing in the cold, dark, and deep waters of the Arctic Ocean are central to the old man and his eventual story of fear and terror, a big part of that. While the narrator expresses uneasiness over the perch that they find themselves on the very top of the mountain, the old man really doesn't express any concern for his safety, and he was almost humble about his comfort being perched atop that. The old man is clearly a Norwegian, indigenous to the territory, and he's quite comfortable in his surroundings. He's clearly brought the narrator to the overlook point for full effect, right? Setting the table for a feast of a story that he's about to lay out for the narrator. Well, the narrator is definitely aware of and knows the territory, the geography, or seems to, at least in the story, as well as seamanship, not nearly as well as the old man who has spent his life in this territory, which is obvious to me. The narration of the outer story wastes no opportunity to describe the oceanic landscape in great and sometimes terrifying detail. And there's a good example, which I'm going to read here, one of my favorite excerpts from the outer story, and it goes like this. The vast bed of waters seamed and scarred into 1,000 conflicting channels, burst suddenly into frenzied convulsion, heaving, boiling, hissing, gyrating in gigantic and innumerable vortices, and all whirling and plunging on in the eastward with a rapidity which water never elsewhere assumes except in precipitous descents. So this is a really interesting excerpt from the story, which really, the old man and narrator are discussing this, and it's almost like they're getting whipped into a lather to hear the story itself. This is just them overlooking the cold, dark terrain, the water, the mountainside, and off in a distance probably the whirlpools and the noises and sounds that come from that territory. So very interesting. In the outer story, the narrator experiences the material elements of the landscape firsthand and observes the old man seemingly with great intrigue. So that takes us to the inner story, right? After the stage is set and the narrator and old man share this time sitting atop the mountain summit, the inner story is told from the perspective of the old man. So the inner story is the meat and potatoes of this piece. The old man tells a harrowing tale of dangerous fishing trip that he navigates with his two brothers. The old man describes the science of seamanship and intricacies of navigating the treacherous Arctic Ocean while trying to avoid the whirlpools or maelstroms, as they're known, in the process. So not the first time that the brothers have ventured along somewhat of a dangerous endeavor to fish. Although the old man escapes death, before I get there, I guess, eventually the story escalates as the old man obviously realizes that he's made a serious error in judgment while they're, fishing. In fact, toward the end of their fishing trip. He tells, or he loses track of time by letting his watch run down, which is really his tragic mistake. His error causes them to miss the tide and become caught in a ferocious hurricane or storm, at which point he did lose his younger brother, who was holding onto the mast, which had broken off, and his younger brother was thrown into the freezing water and lost. And eventually, leading up to the facing a descent into the maelstrom, going into the whirlpool itself, where he lost his older brother, is a part of the story. So, although the old man does escape death, outsmarting the grip of the maelstrom through his own observations, he will never be the same, right? He's affected not only, with the horror of getting through this storm, this hurricane, this whirlpool, but also, having to survive on his own, etc., losing his two brothers, obviously horrifying in and of itself. So interestingly, the old man makes his observations after resigning himself to death. He was kind of starting to he became focused on making his peace with himself and saying, hey, it wouldn't be so bad to kind of see where the bottom of this thing goes. But perhaps that gives him the inner strength and calming peace of mind to solve this puzzle. And what he ends up observing is that some of the lighter objects, as they were whipping around the maelstrom or the whirlpool, actually rose up to the top, while the heavier items, the boat and other heavy items, were rapidly descending further into the maelstrom. So, my favorite excerpt from the inner story epitomizes the ratiocination of exact science and rational thought, which was somewhat shortly described at the beginning of the video. The old man states as follows: I made also 3 important observations. The first was, as a general rule, the larger the bodies were, the more rapid their descent. The second, that between 2 masses of equal extent, the one spherical and the other of any other shape, the superiority in speed and descent was with the sphere. The third, that between the 2 masses of equal size, the one cylindrical and the other of any other shape, the cylindrical was absorbed more slowly. So it was the exact science and rational thought that spared the old man. Essentially, he, with his brother, were both on the schooner, the boat, holding on to a ring or an eye hold, and observing that the cylindrical, spherical, items, the lighter weight items, rose to the top, decided to make a leap of faith and try to save himself through all this, try to urge his brother to join him. Of course, the older brother does not, and perishes with the schooner down at the depths of the maelstrom, while the old man does make the leap of faith and grab onto a barrel, item, and eventually goes up and out of the maelstrom and saves his own life. So, toward the end of the inner story, the end of the short story as a whole, the old man thinks, would others believe this tale, this story, and which is an interesting way to kind of end the story. But clearly, the climax was the old man's decision, and subsequently his jump off the schooner and you know, the fact that he saved his own life. And of course, you know, one of the big things with this story is that afterwards, his friends, you know, hearing the story, you know, immediately recognized that his face had changed. His hair went from dark to just a white, from fear, presumably. So definitely a you know a terror-ridden you know way to end the story, but yeah, interesting stuff. So what I took away from the story, and by the way, I did have a artistic rendering here of the you know, the picture depicting the old man jumping from the schooner towards a barrel and upwards in the maelstrom. What I took from the story. So from my point of view, the tragic hero is the old man. His tragic error was that he lost track of time, didn't realize that his watch had in fact stopped, and as such, that they missed the tide window. And common to tragic hero traits, the old man faces a very serious decision following his scientific observations within the maelstrom, and eventually takes a leap of faith to save his own life. As mentioned, as Aristotle once said, a man doesn't become a hero until he can see the root of his own downfall. The old man sees the root of his own downfall, but only after it was too late. He quickly realized that his clock, his watch stopping, you know, represented big problems for them. So the old man's story did arouse fear and empathy in me. My heart dropped, as I'm sure his did, when he realized his tragic mistake. While his weakness could have been his pride, claiming that lesser fishermen lacked the courage and perhaps skills to navigate the treacheries of the Lofoten Islands. Although his brothers perished in the descent of the maelstrom, the old man has to bear with survivors' guilt, along with the terror from his experience, which of course turned his hair white, for the remainder of his life. So that's it. That's the video and my final project. I hope you enjoyed the storytelling and the artistic rendering that I came up with. I really enjoyed the short story, and this is my final project from your class professor. I know you know that I love your classes, and that you know, this one is certainly no different. I really enjoyed it thoroughly, and thanks so much for everything. Have a good one. Bye.